Hey guys, subscribe for daily content, and if you're shopping for gear, make sure you check out the description for the newest items at some of the very best online retailers. There's also links for some of the items that I personally recommend. Thanks! What's going on YouTube? Metal Complex here, and today I've got another interesting knife review / knife overview to share with you guys. This is the Civivi Starflare. Very cool, very, I don't know if I want to call it modern, it's kind of a futuristic design, but just a really cool design overall. This is a good example of like Civivi just experimenting with more complicated stuff, right? It's aesthetically going to be to the taste of some people and not to others, but I do find it really interesting. The other cool thing is it's still a budget knife. This knife comes in under $75. I would have to remember what my line was, under 75 bucks. We'll talk more about that. I will link this knife down in the description so that you guys can check it out. It does help my channel when you use those links, but that's, of course, entirely up to you. Thanks to my patrons for supporting me. Thanks to Civivi for sending this one in. And please make sure to follow me on Instagram at metal_complex and on TikTok at _metal_complex. Let's go ahead and get a measurement of this knife. The Starflare is coming in. I'm going to forget the name of this like during the review. There's so many like noun combinations out there. My brain just loses it during reviews sometimes. But anyways, the overall length is coming in just shy of 8 inches, 7.85. Blade length, 3 1/4. Cutting edge, a little tiny bit over. It's like 3 1/16. Let's go ahead and do some size comparisons. Any custom skills you find in this section can be found down in the description under Original Goat and others up against the 8010 and 8020.5. You can see here, I wouldn't call this a big knife, but it is definitely larger than knives like the 8020.5, not nearly the same size as stuff like the 8010. How about up against the Spyderco PM2 and the Spyderco Para 3? I would say much closer to the size of the Para 3. Quite a bit more cutting edge, though. You know, it actually is approaching the length of the PM2. It's got a weird aesthetic that's really throwing me off in terms of size. And then finally, let's put it up against the Benchmade Griptilian, or in this case, the Ritter Hogue and the Hogue Deca. Definitely comparable. About stuttered over the word Deca. It's much more comparable to the size of the Deca. How is the action? This knife is a button lock. It's an actual plunge lock knife. Push down on the button and it drops. This does not seem to have much of a drag issue. Releasing it initially is on this knife. I think that's probably just a break-in thing. But pushing the button down does allow the blade to drop. And it's got a super satisfying thwack. You can hear it into the open position, whether you reverse flick it or you thumb flick it. The plunge lock acts as the detent, and sometimes that has a little bit of a, you know, not a super satisfying release. This has a very distinct, like, ledge, I guess, for release. And then the sound of it opening is satisfying. The leverage I'm getting off of the thumb stud, the placement of the thumb stud, and the size and style of the thumb stud are also very, very good. This feels super high quality. Just remembering some of the first Civivi knives that I ever handled, which they've always been good. It's just amazing how much better this feels than some of that stuff from years ago. It's really pretty great. Let's go ahead and do thickness up against the, we're going to do carry profile, sorry. Thickness up against the Spyderco Para 3. It might just be marginally thicker, just a trivial amount of thicker material. Length and height up against the PM2 and Para 3. This is going to carry very similar to the Para 3, not quite as tall, and we're near the same size as the PM2. Let's go ahead and do a hardware check. I'm going to get out my tools as per usual. My tools are very inexpensive and very recommendable. You can find them right down in the section of my description that talks about the tools I use on this channel. Pivot is almost certainly a T8, and the body screws are also probably T8, and they are. We have 2 screws on each side. I almost wasn't aware that they were there, and I'll tell you why. These little milled lines with the holes, at first when I went over to this side and I put the bit in there, I was like, is there show side hardware? They're really nicely masked with the design here, like the milling. So I kind of like that. I kind of like that they managed to hide those. And I mean, they made them the same color and very close to the same size as these little holes that are just decorative. So that's kind of cool. In any case, though, we have T6 for the pocket clip screws, and you can mount it on either side, which is great. T8 for the pivot, T8 for the body screws. Very easy to take apart as long as you have the right tools for the job. You should be good to go. Let's go ahead and weigh it. We're looking at aluminum and nitro V for the materials, which are perfectly acceptable at the budget territory. This is a 3.39 Really, really struggling today, guys. I don't know what's going on. 3.39 ounce knife with 3.25 inches of blade. That is pretty good. And the balance here is actually right behind the pivot. That's got really nice balance. Really, it feels like a lot of knife for, not a lot of weight and a very compact design. Let's go ahead and measure the blade stock thickness, and then we'll get into the meat and potatoes. Much like other Civivi knives, I don't think this is going to be much more than 125 thousandths. It might actually be less. Yeah, it is 115 or so thousandths. All right, meat and potatoes. Like I said, not everybody's going to love the look of this, but it does look like Civivi is evolving in some areas of their line. The nice thing about Civivi is you can't look at one Civivi and get a good idea of what all of them look like. I always say for people starting off in the knife world looking for a good knife, don't go to Temu and buy junk. If it were me and I was starting out in the knife world, if I was giving advice to somebody starting out in the knife world, we took a huge tangent here. 100 times out of 100, I would say spend a little bit more money with a company like Civivi. Get an original design, get something that's actually made well, get something that's made by people who care and not people motivated to deceive. Because people who are motivated to deceive will inevitably produce garbage. It's very easy to feel like you got a great deal from Temu at $20 or $30, when in reality you got something that will fall apart and inevitably cause you to have to buy more of that junk over a short period of time. Anyways, you know what I'm due for? I'm due for another Knife Guy episode on that, so I can expand that into a larger discussion. Anyways, oh my gosh. Anyways, I do like that Civivi looks to be evolving and bringing some wilder, some crazier aesthetics to the budget territory of the knife world, because for so long we were kind of damned to flat G10 and D2 or 9CR 18MOV, which is fine, right? But it's nice that they still offer plain Jane stuff like that for a little less money, and stuff that's a little bit cooler, a little more designy for people who want to spend just a little bit more but are still on a budget. This knife ends up being wildly comfortable. This area right here, this rounded area, is super comfortable. Very rounded edges here. It is flat, but just it kind of gives the impression that it might be contoured. Like if you closed your eyes and picked it up, you're like, oh wow, because everything feels so nicely rounded off at the edges. I like this. I guess we're going to call it a pivot collar. It is not something that's absolutely necessary in terms of, utility or functionality. It's more of a decorative thing. But without this gray pivot collar, I think the whole knife would be substantially less interesting. It's really like your eyes are drawn to this area and it just works. It makes the whole thing look cool. I also like this line right here that separates the black and the satin finished area. I also like how it connects right here with this line, and then the other side of that, on the other side of the pivot collar, it sort of connects back here and goes down. It's really cool. It's something that you don't notice right away, but you can tell that there's something very, I don't know. I always reference the buildings from the Halo games, right? And I don't know what word I'm looking for there, but that's kind of what it makes me think of. Wharncliffe blade, that's what I'm going to call it. You can correct me if you want. Nice tip, very, very, this is the type of blade that I like to use day to day because I do a lot of draw cuts and shaping stuff, shaping cuts. I am not a professional of anything, and I don't require any specialized pocket knife for what I do. I'm a regular Joe, but as a regular Joe, I love blade shapes like this. From a utilitarian standpoint, it's really cool. But I also like my knives to look cool and be fun, right? It's just part of, you're watching this video for the sake, because you're the same type of person, most likely. Even if you don't like this, you probably have a similar thought process, and, I get that. But anyways, yeah, huge fan of the profile, huge fan of the look, very comfortable. Manipulating it with your left hand is arguably easier than your right hand. So lefties, I think you'll actually have a better experience with this button locks in general. It is worth noting, though, if you are left-handed and you choke up, you could actually squeeze that button lock down and disengage the knife, though I'll admit it's pretty hard to do, but you should be aware of that. As a right-handed person, none of your fingers will naturally fall on top of the button, so not likely, right? Choked up or not. It's really just left-handed people and choked back, and that's generally the same case with most right-handed button lock knives. Let's see here. The blade, honestly, is pretty darn thin behind the edge. Not a laser beam, but thin enough that it'll make short work of, basic day-to-day materials that you might cut, cardboard, paper, you know, zip ties, rope, rubber, things like that. We have a couple of standoffs back here. Pocket clip is very basic, and they still insist on that Loch Ness Monster bill, which will snag. It just will, right? But functionally, it does work. There's no specific lanyard hole, but you could attach a lanyard right here to the pocket clip, which is fine. It doesn't need a lanyard hole. Not many people attaching lanyards to pocket knives anymore. Very smooth in and out of the pocket because of the aluminum surface. And honestly, I really like aluminum. I prefer the feel of aluminum on pocket knives over G10 usually, right? The downside is it's not super grippy. And, you know, the hard coat Type 3 anodizing, it'll mark up. It's durable, but it'll definitely mark up, and some people don't really like how that looks. But again, the nice thing about Civivi is you have so many choices. There is a stop pin located in its traditional position. Button lock knives are not known for insane lock strength, so you will not be able to pry the door off a bomb shelter like you would with a cold steel triad lock knife. But I think the more important question is, why are you doing that? The plunge lock on this knife is sturdy enough to resist a few light spine taps, which is really that's all that I really require. I don't do a lot of tasks that require me to put force on the spine, but I do think that locks should hold up in situations where there might be force on different sides of the knife, depending on what you're doing, what you're trying to wrench it out of, right? I can understand that. But I don't think, you know, it's like I've always said, an extensive spine whack test, I think, is completely pointless. So the plunge lock is good enough. No blade play up, down, left, or right. A little tiny hint of lock stick that should work itself out. No pivot lash. Very smooth and consistent in here. And one of the best plunge lock detents. God, that's good. I would think that was a detent ball. Really nice. Blade is centered. Perfect. Very good. So, ultimately, what do I think of this knife? I think that this is a very well-designed utilitarian pocket knife that is also very designy. It's really cool. A lot of times, you know, people think you have to go with a designy knife that sacrifices utility, or you have to go with a knife that is incredibly boring, but is insanely utilitarian and makes for a good tool. This very much splits the difference, and it's a shining example of Civivi's ability to identify the necessity for both, given who is usually shopping at this price point. I think it's safe to assume that people who are shopping for knives that are right around 70 bucks, which this is about 72 bucks, you want a good tool, but at the same time, you want something that's a little bit, you know, it's got some extra there. And Civivi does a great job. They've figured out, it was really hard when they introduced Sencut. I was like, so they're going to have like a budget brand and they're going to have like another budget brand? Like, why not just make them all under Civivi or all under Sencut? They wanted to kind of bump up, take Civivi knives and make them a little more interesting, right? Justify some of the higher price tags they put on them, while at the same time still offering, you know, budget knives, like extreme budget knives through Sencut for people who don't want that extra. And I think they're doing, like, knives like this, it's a good example of how Civivi has really figured out how to do that properly. I like this knife. I like the Nitro V steel. I like the materials. The price point, 72 bucks. I think that's, you know, pretty good. It's not like, oh my gosh, you know, slap me twice and call me Martha. Like, it's not like that, but it's great. I don't have a problem with it. I'm going to put this in two playlists, my recommended knives and my cheap knives I like playlist. This is a good one. Thank you again to Civivi for sending this in. Please check out the description for this knife and all the different variations. You can follow me on Instagram at metal_complex. And like I said at the beginning, at least for the time being, you can also follow me on TikTok at _metal_complex. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like. If you'd like to check out my other content, I do, of course, have lots of videos of knives that are either expensive or inexpensive that I do or don't like, so check those out. And if you enjoy all my content, go ahead and click on that Metal Complex logo right there and subscribe, because there's definitely more coming. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and have a great day.